So I'd like to welcome you all to what is sure to be a lively, challenging discussion on the current situation in Gaza, but also by extension the ongoing Palestinian occupation, the Palestine-Israel conflict, aka the occupation. My name is Helenos. I am a current student at the University of Auckland, and I'll be facilitating the discussion today, and I'll be making sure that even the toughest contentions are tackled by this great group of panellists we have here today. So I'll introduce who we've got here. Start with David. Dr. David Mayeda is a lecturer in the university in the Department of Sociology. He researches the area of violence prevention. So thank you for being here, David. We've got Lama Almoayyed, an ex-student at the University of Auckland and also a practicing lawyer. We have Nadia Abu-Shanab, who's Palestinian local activist and actually a coordinator at the Auckland Action Against Poverty, does some great work in the community. We've got beautiful Marama Davidson, a social justice activist, and also happens to be a Green Party candidate. Normally wouldn't invite politicians, but she's an exception. We've also got the esteemed Professor Jane Kelsey. She's a lecturer in the law faculty here at Auckland. She researches, she's one of New Zealand's best known commentators on decolonisation, structural adjustment and globalisation. Now, there has not been a ceasefire in 66 years since what the Israelis call Independence Day and what the Palestinians call a Nakba, or the beginning of the ethnic cleansing and the occupation of their land. So it's quite clear that this has really nothing to do with the 3 Israeli boys that were murdered, nor does it have anything to do with the rockets fired from Hamas. What this really is about, and what I'm hoping we'll tackle in this panel discussion, is settler colonialism, apartheid, and the right of those who have been colonised and oppressed to resist. So we can see that violence manifests differently. It is not merely about bombs and guns. The starvation of dignity, opportunity, and human rights for those living in Gaza and those in the wider occupied territory is violence. The apartheid wall separating Palestinians from Israeli settlers is violence. The checkpoints, arbitrary detention, and imprisonment of Palestinians, including children, in fact, is violence. Having different laws for Jews and Arab Israelis is violence. So let's move beyond this idea that criticising Israel is anti-Semitic and the rhetorical focus on the ceasefire between Hamas and Israel, which clearly ignores the historical context that we just saw. This panel discussion is about interrogating buzzwords like apartheid, colonisation, genocide, two-sided conflict. What do they mean? Why are they invoked? What does international law have to say about this? What is New Zealand's role? And with that, let's kick this panel discussion off. Yeah, maybe we'll start with Lama.
Sure. I'd like to tell you a bit about me, first of all. My mother is Palestinian. She grew up in Palestine. And then during the 1967 war, her dad was working in Jordan at the time. Because he was outside Palestine at the time, when he came back to live on their land, they weren't allowed back. So my grandfather, could never really come back and live with his family. He had land there right by his grandfather. He tried for about 7 years to come back, and all they would allow was for his family to go to the Israeli government and to get a permit to come visit. He went to visit a couple of times. He had to sell his land, and they ended up settling in Cairo. My grandfather tried hard to get the Israeli government to allow his dead body to be buried in Jerusalem, where he had grown up, and he wasn't allowed to get that either. So that was his dream before he died. So you can see that it is very emotional for quite a few of us when we talk about the Israeli state. But the thing that makes it an apartheid, in my eyes at least, the destruction of Palestinian homes. So my great-grandfather was evicted from his home. He had to leave and find a new home from Jaffa to Nablus. And in the place of where he lived, Jewish settlements were created. They took over his land. In terms of the people that live in Palestine, there's an ID system, permits. So you are allowed in certain areas of Palestine or Israel in the West Bank. So let's say we're all on a bus and the IDF stops it and comes on. If you're a Palestinian, you have to show your ID, show them that you are allowed to be in that part of the West Bank that you're in, similar to past laws. You cannot visit family if they are in a part of the West Bank that you're not allowed in. And there is the separation wall, which is actually built not around certain areas, but in between. It crosses through Palestinian land, crossing through farmers' land, crossing through and making it clear that that some Palestinians can't see the rest of their family who live on the other side of the wall. There are checkpoints. My friend who's recently come back from Palestine has described them as pretty much cattle being herded. So you have all these people trying to get through this checkpoint, and the Israeli soldier sitting and deciding who can come through is usually 18 years old, so a boy sitting there deciding who can come through and who can't. The people are so crowded within those rows that they're given. You can see pictures of it. It's quite distressing, really. And then they come to this turnstile, and you come into the turnstile, and the Israeli behind the glass doors can decide to stop the turnstile. So she's seen instances of people caged in this turnstile for 10, 15 minutes, not able to move. They look over at this Israeli who's behind this glass wall, and he's on his phone texting while people are being herded like cattle. She also describes this other image of her sitting with two other New Yorkers, and this young Palestinian girl in her little pink backpack walking up to this checkpoint, and there are 3 lines that she could go through. No one at the checkpoint. So this girl walks up to the first line, walks up to the gate's locked. She looks over at the Israeli soldier. They make eye contact. The soldier doesn't do anything. She walks back, walks to the next line, walks to the gate, tries to open it, looks over at the Israeli soldier. The Israeli soldier looks at her, doesn't do anything. She walks back, walks to the third line, and this happens over and over again, and the Israeli soldier just would not open the gate for her. And they were sitting there and wondering why he wouldn't, and they realized it was just all about control. It's about controlling these people. A child in a backpack trying to cross.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think certainly that stuff about the daily realities of occupation is not the stuff we always hear, particularly when we're going through a period of increased violence. We are not hearing about what is happening in the daily reality of Palestinian life. So thank you for just kind of giving that context. I think we invoke the word apartheid, and there's a reason we do that, and it's not to make a complete and an entire equivalency between what happened in South Africa and what happened in Palestine, although those comparisons have been made by South Africans themselves who've gone there and seen what is happening on the ground. Some of them have actually said it is worse. I actually don't think it serves us well to compare different forms of oppression, and say this is worse or this is better. But certainly, it's not to say that they're the same thing, but it's to say that what underpins them is similar thrusts. And the thrust, that kind of underpins this situation is, and the basis for apartheid, is a system of separatism. So whether you are a Palestinian who lives in Gaza, whether you are a Palestinian who lives in the West Bank, like many, many, many of my family members, because I have a huge family, or whether you are a Palestinian who lives in the 48 territories within Israel, with Israeli citizenship, you have or come under the duress of different laws. And that is the fundamental point. If you live under the West Bank, you live under military rule. That means that a settler, and this has happened in my family's village, can come in and shoot a Palestinian with impunity. This has happened. And that they come under the Israeli civil court. But when a Palestinian does something, and even if they don't do something, in the case of my cousin Arafat Jaradat, who was killed last year in an Israeli prison, on suspicion of throwing a stone, you come under military law. And so what that means is you can be arrested for up to 3 months at a time without charge. Without any charge, without even being accused of anything. You can be arrested on suspicion, as Arafat himself was, of throwing a stone. So that is that reality. And upon his arrest, he was killed. He was tortured to death. He had not actually been charged with anything. This was 24 hours after his arrest. And that is the reality of being a Palestinian. The laws that apply to Israelis, the laws that apply to Jewish citizens, do not apply to Palestinians, even within Israel. Israel talks about being a tolerant democracy, but there are 50 plus laws which discriminate against Arabs. Some of them explicitly discriminate against Arabs, such as the right of return law, which Lama Almoayyed was sort of referring to, because she's talking about the fact that her family cannot go home, despite the fact that some of them were born there. My father was born in the West Bank. He cannot get anything more than a 3-month visa. However, growing up in England, my best friend is of Jewish ancestry. She, through that ancestry, although never ever having visited Israel, never having a single family member for generations and generations and generations who has ever set foot on that land, is entitled to an Israeli passport and could move there tomorrow should she want to. So when we think about apartheid, it's really fundamental that we remember that there are actually fundamentally different laws which apply to Palestinians as those that apply to the Jewish population.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Marama Davidson tōku ingoa. He uri ahau no ngā iwi o ngā puhi, te rarawa, ngā te prau hoki. Tēnā koutou ki te mana whenua o tēnei rohe o tāmiki makaurau. Kia ora everybody. I do not have too much to add to these really important real-life stories of apartheid, but I keep thinking about relativity to here in Aotearoa, and that apartheid is not just about separate laws and different laws for different groups of people, but those laws proactively seek to subjugate and undermine particular groups. We can have, as we know here in Aotearoa, we can have differences that apply to different groups of people, as we do have, for example, Māori representation in government. But those seats do not subjugate or deny the rights of other people to have a vote, to participate in democracy, to participate in government. So we need to be quite distinct, that apartheid separation laws are clearly about denying another group of people basic and human civil liberties.
I would like to bring up the access to water and resources, which I think is quite an important point. The World Bank in 2009 said that Israeli settlements in the West Bank, which are about 15% of the population, get access to over 80% of freshwater resources. This means that there is huge water shortages for Palestinians. So 450,000 settlers in 2012 used more water than 2.3 million Palestinians. Israel has also been found to deliberately destroy wells, reservoirs, and water purification plants. In Gaza, 90% of the water is undrinkable. The UN says that by 2020, Gaza will be unlivable. These are situations that we can't ignore when we look at what's going on now. There is a bigger picture. There is a humanitarian crisis. And just one more thing, sorry. There's also just the point of the psychological warfare, which is something I've heard quite a lot from people that have come from there. Every night, pretty much, you're afraid as a Palestinian that there might be a house raid. Israelis can come to your door, knock on the door, come in, shake people up, put everyone inside a room for 6 hours for a week at a time while they use your house as an outpost. This information has come from Breaking the Silence, which is a group of Israeli soldiers that have come out against the things that they've done in the IDF. Breaking the Silence, just a couple of months ago, stood in a square in Israel and for 10 hours recited their personal accounts of what they've done to Palestinians, just to prove a point that this is not exceptional, this is unexceptional, this happens all the time. My friend who had just gotten back from there was saying that she felt like she had suffered. So she spent 2 years there working at an NGO, helping children from refugee camps in terms of giving them a childhood, the childhood that they've never had. And after spending 2 years there, she said coming back to New York, she felt like she had suffered a form of PTSD. Seeing buildings reminded her of checkpoints, seeing jeeps reminded her of IDF jeeps. She would freak out every time she saw one of these things. And she was saying, this was just after 2 years of being there. Imagine living there, imagine growing up there.
I just want to add one thing to what Marama said, because I think that was a really important point. And actually, I think this is why this kind of a setup works, because someone can make a point and you can actually reevaluate, what you said, because I agree, actually. I think, it's not just about a difference in law, it's about a difference in law that gives you access to your dignity on a basic level. I think a lot of the time, actually, for me, I'm not an expert in law. I think the interesting thing is how people are treated and how they're made to feel and what they have access to. We talk about rights, but yeah, it's just being able to live in dignity and being denied that or not. And I think there are different laws which actually do allow people to live in dignity. But if those laws are denying dignity, then I think that's where we need to be concerned. And another point I want to raise is, I think sometimes we can have actually the same laws and that they can be applied on a discriminatory basis, just like we see here in Aotearoa with our prison population. We see that laws are applied differently. We see institutionalised racism. We know that exists. And it's the same case within Israel. Even laws that are supposedly equal on paper are just applied on a discriminatory basis. So that's to say that a Palestinian village within Israel does not have as many ambulances per capita on a basic level. So you're not resourced in the same way. Just like here in Aotearoa, and I'm working with, communities out in South Central Auckland, South Auckland, we see that people do not have the same access to resources as they may do in Ponsonby. So it's about actually the allocation of resources and the way that things are, even if on the surface are equal, they're applied in a discriminatory way. So that's another way of sort of separating people and repressing one group. Yeah.
So going from that, what does it mean when the media portrays what's going on right now? So we've given the wider context, but what does it mean when the media portrays this as a two-sided conflict? Especially, the media has done this in many ways, but I think what's striking is that it attempts to justify the current bombardment and ground invasion by blaming Hamas rockets, or even goes as far as saying Hamas hides weapons in homes and uses civilians as human shields. So these are all examples of an attempt by the media to portray this as a two-sided conflict, as actually, so I was, maybe you could take a jab at it, David, or...
Sure.
Yeah.
Kia ora, aloha. Thank you all for coming. So, one of the things that always happens when we see violence emanate in the world is those who are perpetrating violence almost always try and justify it. And what we see here happening in Gaza, the West Bank, this region of the world really, are these different kind of ways that our mainstream Western media tries to justify horrific levels of very overt violence that we've talked about today, but also kind of the slow structural violence that happens to colonized indigenous people worldwide. So whether it be the checkpoints, the raids that are a lot more overt, or the slow structural violence that happens on a daily basis, the unequal access to water, to healthcare, to education, and so on and so forth. So Golda Meir was the Israeli prime minister from 1969 to 1974, just a few years after the Six-Day War in 1967. And these were Golda Meir's words at that time of her time in power. There was no such thing as Palestinians. It was not as though there was a Palestinian people in Palestine considering itself as a Palestinian people, and we came and threw them out and took their country away from them. They did not exist. This is the dominant narrative that we hear about indigenous peoples across the world. This idea of terra nullius, which in Latin means land belonging to no one. And the slogan that was used in Israel by Zionists was, this was a land without a people for a people without a land. Okay? So this is some of the ways that Zionists have justified these horrific levels of very overt and the slow structural violence that's been happening now, for decades upon decades. Okay? And then we see these buzzwords that happen when the more overt violence happens, that Israel has the right to defend itself because a couple of people were, and this is tragic, were kidnapped, killed, but then that's justification for bombing a very dense part of the world. Over 1,000 people killed, 1/4 of them children. Okay? Hamas is using civilians as human shields. Hamas hides weaponry in schools, mosques, homes, medical facilities. It's okay to kill civilians if we warn them first, or these civilians are willing to die themselves as a form of cultural martyrdom. There are all these kind of new buzzwords that the Israeli state is now using in order to justify its violence. Okay? In a very short-term perspective, ignoring this history, which said, oh, these people didn't live there. The British census of Palestinians in 1922 said there was 672,000. Again, British census, 1947, 1.3 million. It was not a land without a people for a people without a land, not at all.
I think it's also quite important when talking about the two-sided conflict to actually think about who these two sides are. So on one side, you have Israel, gets $3 billion of US aid every year, the only nuclear power in the Middle East, strongest military power in the Middle East, 11th most powerful military in the world. And then on the other side, you have Palestinians, a stateless population that lives either as refugees, as civilians under occupation, or as second-class citizens within Israel. One side controls all the resources. One side controls all the movement. One side can kick you out of your home and take it. One side can raid your home. One side can move Jewish settlers onto your land. There is a discrepancy in power. You can't ignore that. You can't say there are two sides to every conflict. in terms of the self-defense argument, as the occupying power, Israel has an obligation and a duty to protect its civilians under its occupation. So Israel, under international law, has a duty to protect Palestinians. It cannot simultaneously occupy the territory and give Palestinians no self-governing power and then declare war upon it. The population is very vulnerable.
Jane, do you want to talk about the law of proportionality, or do you want to?
Do I want to talk about the law? I mean, the law in so many ways seems irrelevant, but it's powerful at the same time. I just want to start, though, by reiterating the amnesia about history, because all of the discussion that we've had in the media treats these as isolated incidents that do not have a context, not even the immediate context, but certainly not the historic context. And the historic context of colonisation is about power, and it's not just military power, it is about killing an economy, it is about killing a political structure, a legal process, a sense of identity and culture, but it has a paradoxical effect that people do not surrender. And what we are seeing is resistance to a history of colonisation in a particular moment now, the latest of the episodes. And we do not have that context presented to us when we hear about 3 Israeli boys, or even when we hear about kids targeted on the beach. And it's the same as here. Yeah. I mean, the history was there. History is irrelevant. And some of the discussions that are happening now in the international law arena about the latest tragedies are trying to get international law put in that context as well. And it's a bit of a paradox itself, because international law was made by rich countries. It was made by rich white colonial powers. And so a lot of international law is actually written from the perspective of colonisers and imperial powers to justify what they're doing. But even using that, Israel cannot justify what it's doing. I mean, there are some very basic rules of international humanitarian law which allow for military strikes against military targets for military objectives. Now, you simply cannot claim, with what has happened here with the civilian deaths in Palestine, that this is targeting military targets for military objectives. It is targeting civilian targets for political objectives to terrorise the population into surrender. And the population is fighting back. And so we have a perpetuation going on in a very important document that's just been put out by a group of very eminent international lawyers. They've made 2 important points that I just want to make very briefly here. There is a distinction in international law between civilians and combatants. There is no lawful justification, even in the name of self-defence, to target civilians. It is illegal under international law. You cannot claim it as self-defence, and it constitutes a war crime. And there is therefore a lot of pressure going on for the Palestinians to trigger the necessary legal moves to be able to bring such a claim before the International Criminal Court. And that would make some very interesting dynamics. But the second point, and it deals with this two-sided conflict, they said, yes, it is not okay for Hamas either to target civilians. If they claim there is a civil war, that is not acceptable either. And it's not acceptable in a moral sense for indiscriminate attacks against civilians by anybody. But they say, and I'll just quote them here, two parties to this conflict cannot be considered equal. Their actions appear to be of an incomparable magnitude. So two-sided conflicts assume two sides of equality, to go back to Lama's point. So even in international law, there is nothing that Israel can claim to justify what is being done.
What's being done now has been done before. Civilians were targeted in southern Lebanon in 1996, and in Lebanon 2006, and in Gaza in 2008, 2009. This is not a new situation.
In 2012?
Pardon?
2012 as well?
In 2012 and in 2014 now. So we've looked now at this two-sided conflict, and I think maybe we'll take it back to Hamas, because I'm sure a lot of us want to talk about Hamas and why Hamas maybe rejected the Egyptian-sponsored ceasefire. Because obviously, why would Hamas want to engage in a war that was obviously unequal, that they were definitely going to lose, especially at the high cost to civilians? Perhaps we can go down that road. We can talk about why did Hamas reject the Egyptian-sponsored ceasefire? Who wants to take that one on? Nadia, do you want to start?
Yeah, okay. So again, like, we are talking here in terms of context. So let's draw out the context a little bit, because this narrative about Palestinians as an inflexible, unbending, unrelenting, savage group of people that do not want peace is not a new narrative. It is a narrative we have been hearing for 66 years, okay? It's a narrative we heard in the 90s. It's a narrative we heard in the last incursions into Gaza. It's a narrative we hear around the ongoing farce of the peace negotiations. Okay? And what that narrative assumes, and particularly among the international community, and when we're talking about ceasefires and we're talking about any kind of negotiation between these two parties, is there is an expectation among Palestinians to accept, to a certain extent, the conditions of their existence, to accept to a certain extent, or in fact to a full extent, that Israeli military presence will govern their lives. And that is something Palestinians are not willing to accept. They weren't willing to accept it in 2008, 2009. What Palestinians have said they want, this is the thing, we often separate these things down. We say, oh, this is what's happening in Gaza, and this is what's happening in the West Bank, and they're very different. I would actually say that is not the case. Those are actually colonial separations that have been placed, on top of Palestinians, but Palestinians see themselves as one group, okay? And what Palestinians want collectively, despite a lot of factions, despite a lot of disagreements, like you would have with any liberation movement, like we have in this room here in New Zealand, what Palestinians do collectively want, and I can say this for a fact, is to be able to live in dignity, and is to be able to make their own decisions about their own lives. So Hamas have said time and time again, we want for you to lift the siege. And I do not think in any way that is an unreasonable demand. I do not think, that it is for anyone, anywhere, to say that a besieged population should not have the right to have that siege lifted, because we wouldn't expect anyone in this room to live under those conditions. So the only way we can possibly expect Palestinians to do that is through a campaign of dehumanisation, and we've seen that time and time again. But I also want to say another thing, which is that the interesting thing to understand about the Palestinian psyche is actually that people in Gaza are now at the stage where they would rather, and they've said it in their own words, die under the rubble of their homes than accept a humiliating truce whereby they will see this stuff happening again in 2 years. This is the third incursion in recent years. This is the third time they have watched this happen. And this isn't just about what happens in that exact moment when the bombs are falling. This is about you lose your family members. You don't forget that. You lose your home. That doesn't get rebuilt overnight. People are still suffering the wounds from 2009. People are still living with that. And, there is no hope for Palestinians in a truce or a ceasefire that does not seek to fundamentally change the conditions under which they're living. And I think if we really are to see Palestinians as humans, then we can completely appreciate that that is totally justified.
And actually, just you talk about the siege, perhaps give context to what this siege is and how long it's been going on, and
So basically the siege is, I've seen that someone's been passing around some papers. It actually is quite interesting because you do have the map on it. But you can see that Gaza is this teeny tiny little area on the left of the map. So it's that little green area. And what's happened there is that Israel has blockaded that whole right side of Gaza. So the airspace, the territorial waters, the electromagnetic sphere, the movement of all goods and people, Israel has complete control over. People can't leave, people can't come in, goods can't leave, goods can't come in. If you go into the waters, Israel will shoot. We've seen the Gaza aid flotilla in 2010, where 9 people were killed on a flotilla trying to break the siege. Israel will not allow people to leave. So Israel even saying that it gives people warning to evacuate. Where are people supposed to evacuate to? They are stuck. They are in there and they are stuck. And the funny thing is, in terms of what it allows in, it won't allow cement in. For a while their notebooks were banned. A4 paper, chocolate, ridiculous stuff is banned. These people are living horrible lives, really, and what they're saying is, we won't accept a ceasefire until you say that we can actually live like human beings. I don't think that's an irrational point to make, really.
I just want to make one more point about the kind of idea or the ideas that we have around what Hamas want, because another thing that we constantly hear from Israel was, if Hamas were to stop firing rockets, if they were to cease doing this, then we could negotiate. Now that is not a trustworthy premise. It is not a trustworthy premise, because for 4 months prior to Operation Cast Lead, where 1,500 Palestinians were killed, we saw the least amount of rockets fired from Gaza there has ever been. I think there was maybe 1 a month, or that some months there were none. And that was exactly prior to the time, just before, they saw the deadliest incursion. And we also need to, the one thing that the people of Gaza have achieved in recent years was the evacuation of the settlements in Gaza, okay? And that came about in a context, actually, of violent struggle. It wasn't through negotiating around a table. It came around as a result of the Second Intifada. So Palestinians have not seen negotiations work. That's the other thing we have to understand. They have not We have experienced promises about the lifting of the siege if you were to stop firing rockets. They have stopped firing rockets, the siege has not been lifted. In fact, they have been bombed on a weekly basis, and the siege has actually grown worse. The humanitarian crisis has grown worse. So there are a lot of false promises that we hear in terms of that stuff, and that are important to acknowledge as well.
In terms of them taking 8,000 settlers out of Gaza, at the same time, 12,000 settlers were introduced to new areas in the West Bank. You know, over the 20 years of negotiation, settlements in the West Bank have increased.
So perhaps talk about settlements. Settlements are illegal, right, under UN. Perhaps someone could talk about that a bit. I think we've covered it, but just make it explicit, maybe.
Settlements are definitely illegal.
All right.
The UN has said settlements are illegal.
Tick that box.
Can I quickly backtrack a little bit we were talking about colonialism and apartheid states and whatnot before, and a lot of people like to believe that what's central to colonialism is kind of global economic power, and I would say yes, that is a central element to it. It is not the central element to colonialism. Also very central to colonialism is racism. And so earlier, Nadia asked the question, do we see Palestinians as humans? And so we also want to ask, well, what is racism? So racism, a pretty basic definition, is the hierarchical arrangement of people based along different visual and cultural markers and putting a value on them. And what we see happening here, we've talked about all the unequal access to resources and the more overt deaths and violence and whatnot, is that Palestinians are not valued to the same degree as non-Palestinians in this region, or non-Arabs in this region of the world. And so I want to underscore that racism is absolutely key in this phenomenon that we're discussing tonight.
In terms of racism, I found out that 2 weeks ago, my mother's cousin, who lives in Jerusalem, which is now considered Israel, he is a bus driver. He was done with his shift. It was midnight. He was sitting in the bus, and 2 Israeli men walked up to the bus, knocked on the door. He wouldn't let them in. They opened the door, asked him if he had a lighter. When he spoke, they realized he was Arab. They pulled him out of the bus and they beat him up. He is now in hospital recovering. There have been, I think, 9 deaths in Israel of Arabs that have been beaten up, or, you know, like the racism isn't just in terms of the people in Gaza. There are Arabs within Israel now that are suffering from it.
And very, very quickly, it's a consistent phenomenon across the world in colonized places. So here in Aotearoa, across the Pacific, it's indigenous peoples that are suffering the effects of different types and levels of racism.
Just one supplementary point on that, and I think that was a really, really, really important point to make, David, and I really appreciate that you made it. I was digging around today and I found one of my favourite Edward Said books that was written actually the year I was born, in 1989. And I opened it up, and one of the really interesting things was he talked about the dichotomy whereby a lot of people understand, a lot of people in New Zealand, a lot of people in Europe, a lot of people in the US understand this situation. And he talked about Israelis as ingenious, you know, as plucky, as brave, as concerned with their security, and he talked about, you know, the idea of Palestinians as backward, as fanatics, as savages, basically, ultimately. And I think it's sad but true to see that dichotomy, that lens through which we're taught to view Palestinians certainly has not changed. And even now, when we are seeing a change in our media, we are seeing a bit more of a humanisation of Palestinians. We are yet to see a front page story on the Herald that names and explains the life of a Palestinian civilian victim that has died in this conflict. We are yet to understand what it was they did or what they were like as a human. Even sometimes in the movement we talk about people's names, we want to hear people's names, but we don't even get to hear, their story. The names is one thing, we don't often get to hear the names, but we often are not actually hearing who they were as human beings. So that dehumanisation, it's an age-old thing with colonialism, definitely.
Do you think that that dehumanisation lends to the fact that people are calling it a two-sided conflict, that people call it a war, rather than perhaps calling it a genocide, which perhaps Lama, do you want to go?
I think dehumanization is quite important here, because if people understood that 40% of the people in Gaza are children, that the average age is 17 years old, how can you go to sleep at night? Do you guys look at the pictures? I mean, they are heartbreaking. I don't think anyone who actually allows themselves to look at these people as human beings will be able to stand for it.
I just want to make another point about dehumanisation and about how it makes us view people. And that is that actually I think that, because what we see and when we hear racist myths is we hear a reduction of what people are as well. So there are these conflations, these racist conflations, whereby there is no distinction made between a Palestinian civilian and a Hamas militant. Absolutely none, certainly not in the eyes of Israel, because they'll say it themselves. One day that child will likely be a terrorist, at least in their mind. So we have to understand that the dehumanisation of Palestinians is rife in Israeli society, but also actually within our own context and our own things, our own understandings. We're certainly not empty vessels on this, and there is an understanding of Arabs as a monolith as well, so we don't get to be different types of people that ascribe to different political views or people with different opinions on different things. We are one group intent on the destruction of Israel in the minds of a lot of the world. So yeah.
So going back to even just the way Palestinians are perceived, I think it's a good time to talk about New Zealand's complicity and perhaps this New Zealand's role, especially with the UN security bid that's coming up. I think Kelsey, perhaps you'd have something to add here. Definitely has something to add.
First on the children, like everyone who has watched what has unfolded, I'm sure we have all asked the question of how could we live with that. And when the police commissioner went down to Aotearoa to make the apology this week, and one of the queer there said, well, some people can forgive. Some of these kids will never forget. And I was down in Aotearoa within a day when the raids happened. And the terrorisation of the kids was the most heartbreaking. And you have to wonder at the mentality of those who think that you can put children in those conditions and those children will grow up in a way that does not frame their realities. It's just extraordinary that not only the suffering, but but the mentality that thinks that that's how you win. But Security Council. There's a couple of very interesting things that have happened in the UN in the last couple of weeks. And it shows how the superpower dynamics are operating within the United Nations. In the UN Human Rights Council, there was a very powerful statement that was passed on the 23rd of July. And it reiterated a great deal of the history of the UN's condemnation of what Israel has done with the occupation. And it called for a number of things. In particular, the establishment of a special inquiry, an independent inquiry, that will catalogue what has been happening with the violations in occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem. Now, what was especially interesting was to look at the backdrop to that discussion in the Human Rights Council. Because of the 47 countries, 29 voted for, 17 abstained, and 1 voted against. Now you know who the one is. But the 17 abstentions were what was, I think, most telling in terms of New Zealand's future role in this process. The European Union put enormous pressure on the drafting of that resolution, and Ireland, for reasons that may be quite obvious, had actually wanted to support the resolution, but the European Union decided it would vote as a bloc, which gets a significant number of your 17 abstentions. They did their best to gut the resolution, but when they couldn't get everything they wanted, they abstained. Britain was very interesting because it had said it wanted to vote against, but the strength of feeling around the issue meant that they felt they had instead to abstain. Now that was a key indicator that the pressure that is happening within Europe and other countries is influencing the positions that governments think they need to take within the United Nations. What was more disturbing was that 2 countries that did not have a vote there, but who spoke, Canada and Australia, would have voted with the United States to oppose the resolution. Now, we know from recent visits by our Prime Minister to the United States, and we know from the lack of any statements of any substance from our Foreign Minister, Marama, that were New Zealand in the same position, it is likely that New Zealand would support the United States. We know that in the Security Council, the emergency meeting that they had came up with a vacuous call for a ceasing of the violence. The Security Council has abdicated responsibility. It forced bodies like the Human Rights Council to be able to try to do something that gives some meaning to international law. But when you look at New Zealand's position in this context, you have to ask, and we have to ask, not just ourselves, but them, why do we want to be on the Security Council? And what do we see our role as being in the United Nations? And some of us are old enough to remember that we took an independent stance for justice in the United Nations, as well as in our domestic foreign policy reflected in what we did in the United Nations. Now it looks like our role on the Security Council and any other body that we are elected to will be a lackey to the United States to support its statements. And I just want to wrap that up by saying, so what is Obama saying? Well, on the 20th of July, Obama made a statement that condemned attacks by Hamas on Israel, reaffirmed Israel's right to defend itself, and raised serious concern about the growing number of casualties, including Palestinian civilians and Israeli soldiers. That is what we will be aligning ourselves to, and it is not acceptable that it is done in our name. Kia ora.
Thank you, Jane, so much. Those are really important points that I mainly wanted to come here with tonight, because I applaud the organisers of this event wanting to make this a panel for our voices as community citizens. I absolutely applaud the strength of that position. But I did want to put my colours on the table and declare, yes, I am a candidate for the Green Party. There is no denying that. But part of my point is that, yes, we must mobilise as community people, mobilise our humanity on this issue, but we certainly have politicians and representatives who are supposed to work for us. Now, I highlight the word independence that Jane herself has raised, because I really ponder what on earth our independence is supposed to be doing right now. We should be taking the absolute strongest stand we possibly can as a country against Israel's assault on civilians. It is the word civilians that is particularly important. We should absolutely be exhausting whatever avenues are available to us as a global state to totally condemn all violence against civilians, but be the reverse of what Obama has said. Stand against all violent act towards civilians, but highlight the disproportionate military use by the Israeli government towards the Palestinian people. That should absolutely be our lowest position possible. We should start from that point. We should absolutely be investigating economic sanctions as a country. We should absolutely be calling on the Israeli ambassador here to call for a halt to a ceasefire. We should absolutely be doing everything we can as a state, but we will not, because we are in the back pockets of the USA, exactly as Jane has pointed out, and that's what we need to change about ourselves as civilians and getting our representatives to represent us properly.
We know full well, and I think this does actually play into Jane's and Marama's points, which are really good. It's what Jane was kind of actually saying was something about imperialism, basically, and imperial interests, because we know when there are wars to be had, there is money to be made, and that's just basic stuff. Actually, the occupation is very profitable for a number of, and the war is very profitable. In fact, Gaza itself is a testing ground, ultimately, for new forms of weapons technology. They are being tested on people in Gaza, and then Israel can therefore say later down the line, well, that was very effective. Look how surgically precise that weapon that we used was. And this is the story in terms of our complicity. It goes beyond political complicity. It's also about an economic complicity, which we saw with apartheid South Africa. I would actually say that we need to go beyond just saying we would like a ceasefire and we would like to see sanctions. At a base level, I thoroughly believe in the power of a campaign of boycotts, divestments and sanctions against Israel until it can start treating Palestinians like basic human beings. And what that means a few things. But to start, it actually means doing very little on our part. It means just not allowing Israel to profit off occupation and apartheid on our dollar. That's all. It's not a violent or radical proposition, and it's not a radical proposition to suggest that until Israel can actually end the siege altogether of Gaza, end the occupation of the West Bank altogether, grant Palestinian citizens equal rights, that we don't want anything to do with Israel. We don't want to have economic ties, we don't want to have political ties, and we don't want to have cultural ties. But when Israel is willing to comply with those things, when Israel is willing to treat Palestinians with dignity, yes, let's have an ambassador here, But until that point, we don't want anything to do with you. By 1984, the Labour government had kicked out the South African embassy. And that was from pressure from people within New Zealand, from New Zealand civil society, to say, you've had enough statements of condemnation. You've been told time and time again by our institutions and our bodies that we're over this, that the people are sick of it. They're sick of watching this oppression and this injustice. And when you're ready to actually come to the table and treat these people like human beings, then you are most welcome to sit with us and to engage with us. But until then, no thank you. We will not be complicit in it. And sometimes people say to me, I'm not sure about, this stuff, it's very distant, it's very far away. I know Marama herself has had people say to her, you should be focusing on issues at home. You should be, and that's what I do on a daily basis. We certainly have issues here in Aotearoa. We certainly do. There's a lot of things we need to address. But at the same time, our super fund, our tax dollars, are invested in companies which profit literally off the incarceration and murder of Palestinians. So there is actually blood on all of our hands. And what falls upon us, and it's very simple, it's totally non-violent, it's not a big demand, it's just what Palestinians have asked us to do, is don't do business, don't contribute to that economy of war, don't contribute to that economy of oppression, and don't contribute either, beyond that, to the whitewash of it, because that's the cultural and academic aspects. Because with the institutions, with the research that comes out of Israeli universities, there is a concerted effort to whitewash this apartheid. Even with Bat Sheva, which is a dance troupe that came over here earlier in the year, every single Israeli arts group or artist is made to sign a contract by Israel, and that contract stipulates that you must promote the state of Israel. You must promote the agenda of the state of Israel itself. So we have to recognise that there is a concerted effort going on to uphold this regime of oppression, and that we all have a stake in it. We're actually all complicit. It's not like we have a choice. We're already buying into it. We've already got our tax dollars invested. So all we need to do, it's very simple, is remove that money, remove that silent support. And then Israel can start to feel the kind of isolation that South Africa felt. It wasn't a violent form of isolation. It was merely economic. Because as long as there's money to be made off those wars, as long as there's money to be made off that weapons technology, as long as there's a stake in incarcerating and imprisoning Palestinians, they will continue to do it. But when it comes at a cost, they will stop. You hit people in the pockets, and they'll actually sit down to talk with you. So that's where we need to take this into a campaign where we as New Zealanders, we as New Zealand citizens, we're not waiting on our government to do stuff about it, but we're campaigning in our supermarkets, in our universities, across the board, until Israel can comply with international law. We don't see why we should be complicit in this, and we don't want to be.
Kia ora, Nadia. Kia ora. I just very quickly wanted to, and sorry if this is going back a bit, but I wanted to pick up while it's burning on me, the point of our own backyard and the issues in our own backyard, and that's vital to this entire movement and to the movement of global justice. They are not trade-offs. To be able to care for our own backyards, we must have an awareness of how that intersects with global justice and issues of humanity around the world. And as Indigenous people particularly, we know that having an international awareness strengthens our campaign on our back doorstep. It does not weaken it, and it certainly is not a trade-off with resources and with thinking. To be aware, to be globally aware, is to strengthen your movement back home. And to aid your movement back home is to look for how it connects to what is happening globally. And so I take very personally and very passionately every single time that I am accused that I am not looking after my own backyard first. But I understand it. I understand where it comes from, because we have shit all over many of our own people here. We have done that. And so from that place of loss, I completely empathise with people who may feel like we're putting more emphasis on other issues and not taking care of them. It absolutely is an understandable position to take, but that is what our society does. It sets us up at the bottom against each other. And I will be always very strong that we must do both.
For most of us here, we're not directly part of the in-groups that are involved in this. We are a global audience for most of us, right? Myself included. Y'all have been sitting here for a while, so let's get some audience participation. If you all were walking around on Queen Street and you saw two men getting in a fight with each other, you don't know the reason, but one was much bigger, much stronger, much faster, and he was just pummeling the other person. How many of you, in a safe way, would in some way intervene? Whether that means calling the police or trying to get a group of friends to just separate the two. Right? If you heard what you suspected was a very violent case, well, all cases of intimate partner violence are violent, but a really, really, I guess, loud, graphic case of intimate partner violence from a neighbor, how many of you would, in a safe way, intervene somehow? Those would be what we call illegitimate forms of violence. They're illegal. Right? We're supposed to intervene. Right? What we see here, the way the dominant narrative is being presented in the mainstream media, is legitimate violence. Right? That Israel has a right to protect itself by bombarding Gaza, right, with their much more proficient, devastating weaponry. Right? How many of you, if you went to another form of what society considers a legitimate form of violence, how many, if you went to a boxing match, right, and the two competitors were of uneven size, again, one competitor was much more nourished, had a lot more resources to train with, was just a lot bigger, and he was pummeling his opponent. How many people would intervene? I know it's a lot harder when it's considered legitimate, okay? But sports are supposed to set up equal participation. We don't, in this situation that we're talking about here, we don't have equality or equity. As responsible global citizens, we have an obligation to sacrifice, to be responsible bystanders and intervene. And that can mean a lot of different things. Okay? The economic issues we've talked about already. It can also mean writing to the New Zealand Herald, other mainstream media. It can mean writing to university management and saying we can have an academic boycott, so not to support the Israeli state or their allies. Okay? Not sending students abroad to serve as University of Auckland ambassadors. Okay? Pressure your lecturers not to publish in journals that are connected to the Israeli state. Okay? We can and should do something. It's time for all of us to take action on this.
These are all really important strategies for solidarity, because often we've had 2 rallies in the past 2 weeks, and people often ask us afterwards, now what? So you've given some strategies, sending a letter to the New Zealand Herald, pressuring your lecturers, even in terms of lecture content, just asking the right questions often is a good start point. Are there any other strategies of solidarity?
I just wanted to say, Jane just said that she thought, she'd seen an academic boycott of South Africa, and that she thought that on this issue we couldn't do it. And I think it's really interesting to actually flesh that out. I want to hear what Jane has to say.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this, and there's some others I can see here in the room who were around when the apartheid campaigns were, the anti-apartheid campaigns were very strong on campuses. And I've been thinking in the last few days of why it would be so much more difficult to get some formal measures here. And I think there are 3 reasons. One is when we were dealing with apartheid South Africa, there were very few white South Africans within our universities. No? We have a very different context when we're dealing with an Israeli-Palestine conflict. The second is that there is a lot of money tied up with research collaborations, and there are a lot of interests that commercial institutions of universities have at stake. And that is a driver rather than academic principles in how universities are run. And the third is that the main forums in which we would have debated those, such as the Senate or the Council, have now been totally depoliticised. And I was thinking before about how would we even get a motion on the table of the Senate. And my instinct is that the Vice-Chancellor would actually say that it was outside the standing orders of the Senate and we couldn't even debate it because it was not an academic matter. And I think that symbolises how far the climate has changed, but also the difference in how people approach the apartheid regime and how they approach what is this muddled discourse around Palestine. I just wanted to make one other point, though, which rose when I was reading a piece on the Daily blog during the week, and it made me do a double take as well. And that was Shasha Ali's piece. Those who've been been at the last 2 demonstrations on Saturdays at 2 o'clock from Aotearoa Square. At the end, people have been singing, "We are all Palestinians." And she said, well, we're not all Palestinians. We may be in solidarity with Palestinians, but we are not living that reality. And I thought, well, just imagine if on one of the Treaty of Waitangi marches, we were all singing, "We are all Māori." Yeah? And we're not. Who we are and how we are situated carries different responsibilities on those of us who not only are not the direct victims, but who, if we are drawing the analogies Marama was talking about understanding how those realities refract on our own lives and our privileges where we are, it puts on us exactly the same responsibilities in relation to the Palestinian conflict as it does on those of us who are Pākehā within the colonial realities of Aotearoa. Yeah? And so I'm afraid next Saturday I won't be singing We Are All Palestinians. I think it was an incredibly powerful point for reflection of how we express our solidarity, but we also think really hard about what it is that is the power and privilege that we have and how we can use that in strategies. And I know that there are some people here who have very strong relationships with academics in Israel, who are critical academics in Israel. And I think we need to, as we did in South Africa, take some of the lead from them as to what is the most useful kind of activity that we can engage in.
Kia ora, Jane. I just want to say, I never thought when I was a politics student, reading your books on neoliberalism in New Zealand, that I'd be on a panel disagreeing with you on something. But I think the point that you make about the changing context of the university is really valuable when we're talking about the depoliticisation and the mechanics of how much democracy we have within the university are really important points. I want to actually go off a point you just said there about what critical academics within Israel are doing and what they're calling on the world to do. So last year I was lucky enough to listen to Ilan Pappé. I don't know whether any of you guys have heard of him. He's an Israeli historian who's spent a long time writing about this, and he talked quite specifically about how for a long, long time he felt that the way to go about changing Israeli society was from within. He felt that. He maintained it for decades, actually. And what he wrote in the last few years, and what he's increasingly been writing about, is how much he has changed his mind on that, and that he thinks, and we've seen polling recently that 95% of Israelis agree with the current incursion. Certainly there are Israelis that don't. Some of them are very good friends. And who I've been honoured to work alongside in terms of promoting boycotts, divestment and sanctions. But Ilan said, what we really need to see is we actually need to see boycotts, and they need to be academic. And it's a hard thing for me to swallow as an academic who's worked within Israel and who's wanted to maintain connections, but that we have a privilege within the society, and we must actually separate ourselves from what may be happening in our universities and place ourselves within the broader context and acknowledge that this change will not come from within and the pressure must come from outside. I think that you're right, certainly, that we want to be supporting those academics, and many of them are actually agreeing and saying we need to move towards boycotts. And the other thing that I want to say in terms of moving a motion is that at my time at Victoria University, we did move a motion to affiliate with a university in the West Bank through a Right to Education campaign. Campuses across the US are passing divestment motions. This is happening in one of the most extreme climates in terms of the Palestine movement. You are fighting against a very, very well-resourced, well-funded sort of propaganda forces within the US of suppression that have actually taken legal cases against academics, against activists who are campaigning that their universities should divest from Israel and should not have academic connections. Jake Lynch in Sydney is an academic who's recently gone through a court case because he called for an academic boycott of Israel. And what we see when we have those debates is that we don't necessarily have the same spaces for them, and I agree. But what was really interesting about when we did our motion in Wellington was how full the room was. Everyone at uni commented that it was the fullest Student Representative Council SRC meeting they'd ever seen. And I think we could actually, if we were to bring these debates to our university, flesh them out, have them, and actually create a real passion and interest around these issues, And certainly it's stuff that is happening in Europe, in the US, and that is possible even in this climate where there are forces that certainly work against us. I still, and maybe it's a bit idealistic of me, have a belief in student power within the institutions of public universities. But I know that that is decreasing, and I know that it's under attack on a lot of fronts. But I definitely think we should take from Jake and other academics that have made that call and that have pursued it, as well as the churches and other institutions in the US that have divested and have cut their ties, that this can be done, and we shouldn't be defeatist or fatalistic about it, even under the climate of neoliberalism whereby the university is governed by a lot of commercial interests. I still have some hope that students within the university can have an amount of power to influence how the university is run and what our institution is engaged in. Every single form of oppression that has ever existed has had an intellectual and academic body which somewhat supports and drives it forward. And I think we see that with Israel. So I would love to see us move forward on that, but I acknowledge and I agree with Jane that we are operating in a different context to the one we were operating in, or people were operating in the 70s and 80s in New Zealand.
So, can I just offer one sentence to that? As with the political parties, as with the media, we will only start to get traction. Did I say that? Terrible phrase. We will only start to get traction on these things in hostile voids when there is enough of a critical mass for it to have become an issue that is the elephant in the room that can no longer be ignored. At that point, we can start to bring that pressure on. But at present, we are very far from being in that place.
Yeah. I think this is a really interesting place to end, actually, because what we've come to is that we've got to make this space where this is talked about. I think it's a cop-out for academics at this university and other institutions to say that they cannot be partial in lectures. I've heard this so many times, and I think we really need to pressure our lecturers to take a stand where it matters, to talk about the conflict, because so many of us here didn't know even the basics of the history behind this context, and I think that's really, I think that's such a shame, and I think lecturers that I can see in the crowd here really need to take a stand alongside students and make it clear that we will not be complicit in the occupation any longer.